At the age of 26, I married my childhood sweetheart whom I had liked since I was a kid. However, just 1 year later, he took on a young model as his mistress. I didn't say a word. I just took off my wedding ring, drafted a divorce agreement, and handed it to him. He lit a cigarette and laughed at me. Divorce? What kind of little trick are you playing now? I calmly told him, Calvin, I want to cut my losses in time. So, please sign it. The day I caught Calvin cheating on me was my birthday. I excitedly carried the birthday cake I had made by myself and went to his company to look for him. 2 young girls at the front desk were huddled together, chatting about gossip with their heads down and didn't notice me coming in. Did you see the flowers that President Calvin gave to Eleanor? 999 champagne roses. Such a huge bouquet that 2 people carried it into the lounge for her. This girl has really soared to great heights now. She's only been on the job for a few days and has already caught President Calvin's eye. She's so lucky, but President Calvin is already married after all. You haven't seen Mrs. Calvin. Eleanor looks like her, that's why. Halfway through her words, the young girl suddenly saw me standing at the front desk and her little face turned as pale as a sheet. Mrs. Calvin. I kept a straight face and pushed the door straight in. The lounge referred to the suite on the 9th floor that was reserved for Calvin. He usually stayed there when he took a lunch break or worked overtime. As soon as I got out of the elevator, I heard a strange but clear and charming laugh coming from inside the suite. President Calvin, I've never received such big and beautiful flowers before. I'm so happy. Then Calvin's deep and lazy voice came out, as long as you like them. Also, I've told you so many times that when it's just the 2 of us, call me Calvin. My heart ached. I remembered on our wedding day when I was sitting on the wedding bed and shyly and expectantly called him Calvin. He yanked the tie off his neck and threw it onto the bed. Cecilia, who gave you permission to call me that? Don't forget that this wedding was just to avoid going against Dad's wishes. Given the things you've done, the fact that I didn't lay a hand on you is already a sign of my good upbringing. I knew from that day that he married me and it had nothing to do with love at all, but I thought that in this world, as long as you were sincere, even metal and stone could be moved. So during this year, I tried hard to play the role of Mrs. Calvin well. I learned to cook and make soup, and also learned about business management. I also helped him successfully acquire and merge a large technology group, expanding Calvin's business territory by another piece. I wholeheartedly wanted to be his capable wife and also thought that one day he would be able to see my heart. Unfortunately, I was still wrong. Some things can't be obtained just through hard work. I entered the password and the door lock opened with a click. The sound of the door opening startled the couple inside. Calvin might have had a bit of wine. On his perfectly sculpted face, there were 2 unnatural flushes, and his hands were currently holding a pair of slender and graceful legs, hugging a girl in his arms. The girl heard the sound and turned her head suspiciously, looking angry. Which department are you from? Why didn't you report before coming up directly? Don't you know that this is the lounge reserved for President Calvin? When Calvin saw that it was me, his expression changed slightly. Why are you here? I tightened my grip on the handbag containing the cake. Did you forget? Today is my birthday. It was only 2 hours ago that he sent me a message saying that he wanted to celebrate my birthday today. This was the first time since we got married that he had shown any intention of getting close to me. That's why I eagerly made the cake here. Really and rushed over? I'm too busy to remember. Besides, what are you doing coming to me on your birthday? If you want something, tell the driver to take you to buy it. Don't you see that I'm busy? Get out. I saw a hint of smugness in the girl's bright eyes, and then I understood everything. Looking closely, this girl's facial features did indeed resemble mine a bit. It's just that the slightly upturned corners of her eyes gave her a lively look, which was completely different from my dull appearance now. Suddenly, I shuddered all over, as if an ice pick had stabbed straight into my head. I was all too familiar with this face. People in the company said she looks like me, but her eyes were very much like Amanda's. My twin sister. She and I looked as if we were carved from the same mold. It's just that there's a mole near the corner of my eye. I used to always hear people say that those with a mole near the corner of their eye are destined to shed a lot of tears in this life. And the corners of Amanda's eyes were slightly upturned. Almost exactly the same eyes as Eleanor in front of me. Hearing my words, Calvin couldn't help but let out a snort of laughter. Like you? Cecilia, don't be so self-deluded. Cecilia? So, it's Mrs. Calvin. Eleanor greeted me with a smile, but her hands holding Calvin didn't loosen at all. Today is Mrs. Calvin's birthday? Why didn't you say so earlier? I didn't even prepare a gift. Eleanor looked around and pulled out a flower from the huge bouquet of roses beside her and handed it to me. Here, this is what Calvin just had delivered to me. I'll give you one as a celebration for Mrs. Calvin's birthday. She humiliated me like this, yet still had a bright and flamboyant smile on her face. Because she was certain that Calvin wouldn't blame her. Sure enough, he just pinched her face and gently scolded her, "Don't be so naughty." It sounded more like honey filled with indulgence. Calvin had never spoken to me in such a tone. Eleanor pouted her lips, looking unhappy. You don't even give me face in front of your wife? When she said the words, your wife, the expression on her face was indescribably contemptuous. This confidence was given to her by Calvin. I looked at them and gave a light laugh. 999 champagne roses, how much are they worth? A few thousand yuan? That makes you so happy? How cheap. It suits you well. You'd better keep them. Eleanor's face changed. What did you say? Who's cheap? Calvin patted her back to comfort her and then frowned at me unhappily. Cecilia, apologize. I stared back at him, without a trace of emotion in my eyes. Cecilia, are you deaf? I told you to apologize to Eleanor. What makes you think you have the right to say she's cheap? In my heart, you're 100 times cheaper than her. All my strength seemed to be drained away. I looked down at the cake in the handbag. The cream on it had melted and mixed with the chocolate sauce, flowing down in a sticky and disgusting mess. Suddenly, I felt that all of this was so meaningless. I threw the cake into the trash can by the door and then took out my phone and took a picture of them hugging each other. I won't apologize. Calvin, if you don't want the news of your affair to be reported, which will affect your company's stock price and the future of your little beauty here, come and see me tonight. He sneered indifferently, using this to force me back to you? How despicable of you. I shrugged. See you tonight. By the time I got back to the villa that Calvin and I lived in, it was almost 11 o'clock. The usually eerie villa was unexpectedly lit with a lamp. 03 I walked up to the second floor and Calvin questioned me with a cold face. You asked me to come back tonight, but where did you go running wild yourself? When I got closer he smelled the alcohol on me and the unique fragrance of the club and his expression changed. He took 2 steps forward and tightly grasped my wrist. Where did you go to have a good time? Tell me. He was so strong that it felt like he was about to crush my bones. I went to the egret club that you often go to. What, is there a problem? It's my birthday today. Isn't it reasonable to spend some money to buy blessings and a lively atmosphere? I smiled and said, sure enough, it's the top-notch club. Even the waiter who cut fruit for me was so handsome, with 6-pack abs and an excellent feel. Calvin spat out a few words coldly, you're looking for death. After saying that he suddenly yanked me up, picked me up and threw me onto the bed in the master bedroom. I came back early just for one day and caught you flirting outside. When I'm not at home, do you just put a cuckold on me directly? He pinned me down on the bed, held my hands with one hand and pressed them above my head, and his lips landed on my neck. With his other hand, he tore my stockings. I struggled like crazy under him. Calvin, are you a pervert? Even within marriage, without the other person's consent, it's rape. He suddenly stopped and looked at me with a fierce look in his eyes. Rape you? Ha! I'm not that desperate. Tell me, why did you ask me to come back? I looked at Calvin who was forcibly suppressing his anger and desire, and my eyes inexplicably became moist. Once upon a time, how much I longed to get a kiss from him. Even if he just casually glanced at me, I could be happy for several days. But he didn't know any of this. Because from the very beginning, he had told me that he hated me. When I was 9 years old, Calvin came to our family. Only then did I know that Calvin's father, who was extremely handsome and gentle in my childhood memories, had gone bankrupt in business and jumped off a building, and Calvin's mother sold the last valuable jewelry and gold watch at home and ran away with someone, leaving only 10-year-old Calvin alone to face those fierce creditors. They occupied the Xie family's house and drove Calvin out. Dad couldn't bear it and paid off the remaining debts for Calvin's father and also completed the adoption procedures and brought Calvin to our home. Even though he was so down and out at that time, Calvin still wore his white shirt neatly. I really liked this good-looking and melancholy little brother. But the thread of his white shirt was coming loose. So I took my pocket money and ran around several stores on the street and finally bought him a shirt of a similar style. When I excitedly took the gift back home, I saw my sister Amanda feeding him a piece of strawberry cake with a spoon. Calvin blushed, opened his mouth and swallowed that piece of cake. Amanda smiled at him. He also smiled and said, Amanda, the strawberry cake is really delicious. I suddenly got so angry. That cake was also the one I had bought in advance to welcome Calvin. So I strode over and slapped the cake out of Amanda's hand. What are you eating? Don't eat it. I bought it. Amanda was so scared that she burst into tears. And Calvin pulled Amanda behind him and looked at me with a cold and hard look in his eyes. It's just a piece of cake. I'll compensate you for it. Do you have to scare Amanda like this? I felt a strange sourness in my chest and my eyes quickly filled with tears. Compensate? What can you compensate with? You even rely on my dad for your living expenses. Calvin's face instantly turned pale. I knew I had said something wrong. But just as I was about to open my mouth to apologize, Calvin coldly said to me, Cecilia, has anyone ever told you? You're really annoying. I threw the white shirt I bought for him onto him. I hate you just as much. After that, Calvin didn't say another word to me. Even though I still went to apologize to him later, the look in his eyes when he looked at me was still cold, without a trace of emotion. He only liked to play with Amanda. He would gently call her Amanda, and tenderly tidy up her long hair when the wind blew it messy. To me, he would only stiffly call me Cecilia by my full name. Later, when I was 17, someone asked him, of the beautiful twin sisters in the Arthur family, which one do you like better? He lowered his head and hesitated for a moment. Cecilia is such an annoying person. How could I possibly like her? Perhaps the relationship between Calvin and me was doomed from the very beginning. He was sensitive and self-abased, while I was sharp and tough. Even though I had liked him since I was a child, whenever I saw the look of disgust in his eyes, I couldn't bring myself to tell him what was on my mind. When we were young, even talking about feelings was about dignity and pride. It seemed that whoever bowed their head first would lose. By the time I grew up and learned about a reality, it was already too late. I held back my tears, tidied myself up and stood up. I've already prepared the things and put them on the table. If you think there's no problem, just sign it. 04. He took out a cigarette and lit it. His narrow eyes were full of sarcasm. What kind of trick are you playing now? While speaking, he walked to the table by the window. Divorce agreement? His voice suddenly trembled. What do you mean? I calmly signed my name on the divorce agreement and then handed it to him. What I owed you, now I'll pay you back with my freedom. From now on, we're even. The room was quiet. Only the wind that occasionally blew in through the poorly closed window sounded like broken sobs. Even? Calvin gave a sinister laugh. Cecilia, what kind of scheme are you plotting again? You used Dad to put pressure on me and forced me to marry you. Now, you want a divorce? Where did you learn this new trick? A trace of bitterness rose in my throat. No, I never. Dare you say that it wasn't your idea for Dad to make me marry you? I fell silent. For someone who doesn't believe me, it's useless to say anything more. I took off the wedding ring on my hand. This blue diamond ring was my mother's dowry back then. Later, when my father's factory went bankrupt, this rare blue diamond was also taken to pay off debts. When I married Calvin, he bought this blue diamond back and made it into my wedding ring. I put the ring into the safe. This ring was bought back by you with your money. Please take good care of it. In the future, I'll use money to redeem it. Calvin looked at the shining ring, and his face darkened a few shades. Cecilia, take back your words before I lose my temper. I shook my head. Our union was a mistake in itself. Calvin, I want to cut my losses in time, so, please sign it. I handed him the pen and paper and stubbornly waited for him to take them. Calvin's face turned livid as he took the divorce agreement and tore it to pieces. You're dreaming. I sighed. Why, Calvin? There's no love between us. He sneered. Of course there's no love between us. But Cecilia, since you forced me to marry you in the first place, then you should endure everything now. Don't even think about getting a divorce. He slammed the door and left. Again, I was left alone sleeping in the empty room. Even though I wrapped myself tightly in the quilt, I still felt so cold. My head throbbed with pain. In a daze, I seemed to see Calvin again. However, it was Calvin at the age of 17. He looked at me with that impatient expression on his face as always. Cecilia, what kind of trick are you playing again? From childhood to adulthood, he always said this to me. Probably because I was always pestering him and he hated me so much. I still remember that every day after the morning self-study class back then, I would go to the school snack bar to buy a cup of hot chocolate and then go to the door of his classroom to look for him. If he ignored me, I would stand at the door of their classroom and call his name over and over again. Every time, in the midst of the laughter of his classmates, he would take the things in my hand without saying a word. I just liked to see him looking flustered and embarrassed, yet having no way to deal with me. Later, once I caught a cold and lay on the desk to rest after the morning self-study class and didn't go to find him. During the big break between classes, he blocked me in the stairwell, his pretty brows furrowed like twisted ropes. Cecilia, stop playing this cat-and-mouse game boringly. I'm busy and don't have time to play with you. I opened my mouth, but my throat was as dry and painful as if I had swallowed a blade. I waved my hand at him to indicate that I couldn't speak. But he looked disappointed. Cecilia, you're always like this, looking so high and mighty. It's really annoying. I was so angry that I pushed him away and walked off on my own. After that, for a long time, Calvin would take a detour whenever he saw me. No matter how I called him from behind, he wouldn't pay any attention to me. Amanda said that we were a bickering couple, loving and fighting with each other. This made Calvin fly into a great rage. He said, who wants to be a bickering couple with her? I was sad for a long time. Why was he always so impatient with me? 05. When I woke up, there were still cold tear stains at the corners of my eyes, and my eyelids were swollen. Even when I put on thick eye makeup and went to the flower shop, the little girl Chloe in the shop still noticed it at a glance. Sister Cecilia, where did you go wild dancing last night? Your eyes look like this. She teased with a smile, but there was deep concern in her tone. Chloe had been working part-time here since the flower shop opened a few months ago. This flower shop was the reward I asked Calvin for after we merged that technology group. My childhood dream was to open a flower shop when I grew up. To be surrounded by flowers every day, drinking coffee and basking in the sun. It was so enjoyable. Later, Chloe, who had the same hobby as me, came to work in my shop. She was a typical post-05s, outgoing, sharp-tongued, and surprisingly sensible despite her young age. Apart from this flower shop, she and I didn't have any intersections in other circles. Suddenly, I really wanted to tell someone all the things that I had kept in my heart for many years. So I put up a sign saying, temporarily closed, on the flower shop and then went to make a pot of coffee. Where should I start telling these stories? Probably from the summer when I was 18 years old. The events that happened that summer changed the fate tracks of all of us. That summer, Calvin's mother suddenly came back. Probably having heard that the previous debts had all been paid off, Calvin was doing well now and had also been admitted to a top university. Suddenly, she was diagnosed with cancer and wanted to recognize this son she had abandoned before she died. But I didn't allow it. Why did you abandon Calvin when he had nothing? Now that he can spread his wings and fly high, you want to become his burden and baggage again? So I invited that woman to a coffee shop and gave her 100,000 yuan, asking her to stay away from Calvin in the future. You're not him and don't know his difficulties. Although this money isn't much, it's enough for you to spend for a while. Don't disturb Calvin. Behind the 2 stacks of banknotes, the woman's greedy face was revealed. Calvin has lived with your family for so many years and will probably take care of your father in his old age in the future. Such a good son has gone to your family. 100,000? It's not enough. Give me some more, or else I'll ask Calvin for it. I got angry. Where does he have money to give you? Except for tuition fees, Calvin never took my father's money. His own living expenses and pocket money were all earned by himself through part-time jobs. This woman only saw Calvin living in a mansion, having no worries about food and clothing, but didn't know that her son was sensitive and fragile inside. He's just fostered in our family. He's not really my father's son. When I said this, the wind chimes at the door behind me rang. I turned around. Calvin looked at me with a pale face, and there was sadness in his eyes that I had never seen before. Cecilia, I know my own identity. You don't have to remind me again and again. He walked over and put the 100,000 yuan into my handbag. Take the money back. I'll figure out a way to deal with her illness myself. I quickly stopped his hand. Don't be overconfident. Where do you have the money? I said I'll figure it out myself. He glared at me with bloodshot eyes and shouted at me. He had never been like this before. I saw Amanda behind him and got angry. Didn't I tell you not to tell him that I invited this woman? Why can't you keep your mouth shut? Amanda shrank back a little, but, after all, that's Calvin's mother. He has the right to know everything. How can we not let him know? I was so angry that I turned around, pushed the door open and left. I didn't notice a car speeding towards me at the intersection. I just felt a sudden push on my back and fell to the ground. When I heard the screeching sound of brakes and Calvin's cry of pain and turned around, I only saw Amanda, who had chased after me, being hit and flying high into the air and then falling heavily. A large pool of bright red blood slowly flowed out from under her. Calvin rushed to Amanda's side, trembling as he reached out to check Amanda's breath. Then he raised his head and looked at me. Cecilia. He gritted his teeth, his voice was mournful and the hostility in his eyes seemed to want to cut me into pieces. Then what happened? Then what happened? Chloe asked me eagerly. I took a sip of coffee with my head down. Then? The things that happened later were unknown to Calvin. The person who killed Amanda was a famous rich second generation in our city. That day, the rich second generation had just come out after playing all night at the bar. Being sleepy and drunk, he didn't see me and Amanda rushing out. The father of the rich second generation took out 5 million yuan to make peace with us. I crumpled the check into a ball and threw it at the middle-aged man's face. Our family doesn't lack money. What we want is a life for a life. The middle-aged man wasn't angry. Instead, he even smiled. Little girl, don't be so angry. Forgive others whenever you can. After all, the child didn't do it on purpose. Besides, our new car was also scrapped. How shameless. We appealed again and again but were always told that there was insufficient evidence. Not long after that, my father's company began to have a large number of order cancellations for no reason. The goods were piled up in the warehouse and couldn't be sold even at a loss. A business partner who had a good relationship with my father reminded my father, Yin Huidi, Arthur, as long as the Green Mountains remain, there will always be firewood. Don't confront others head on. Immediately after that, the workers in the factory couldn't get their wages and started to make trouble. The few who took the lead in making trouble looked very unfamiliar. I watched helplessly as my father was beaten until his head was bleeding and he fell into a coma. That was the first time I witnessed the darkness of the real world. After sending my father to the hospital, I went to find that middle-aged man. There was a confident and certain smile on his face. "Little girl, I knew that when you came to your senses, you would come to me." He threw me a check again. "The right price should be negotiated at the right time. Now, this is all you're worth. 2 million yuan. I tightly clutched the check, my eyes swelled with pain, but I couldn't say a word. Thinking about my father in the hospital and those workers who couldn't get their wages, finally I took the check and signed the letter of understanding and consent. I used the money to paid my father's medical expenses, workers' wages, and took out a part of the money and gave it to Calvin to let him treat his mother's illness. He was only a freshman at that time. Even if he lived frugally and worked 2 part-time jobs a day, it was still a drop in the bucket for his mother's illness. Calvin questioned me where I got so much money. I took out the signed and fingerprinted letter of understanding and consent. He was shocked. "You signed this?" "Yeah. What else could I do if I didn't sign it? Was I supposed to watch my father being beaten to death?" He pointed his index finger at me. "Cecilia, are you comfortable with using your sister's life as a means to get money?" I slapped his hand away. "Sorry, but we have to survive first." He looked at me disappointedly and then threw the stack of money at my face. "This is the money for Amanda's life. I don't have the face to take it, nor can I afford to take it." I watched his resolute departing figure and the pain in my chest made me bend over. Big tears fell down. I squatted on the ground crying while picking up the money. A child passed by me and curiously asked his mother, "This sister clearly has so much money for treatment. Why is she still crying?" His mother covered his mouth and quickly left. From that day on, I never saw Calvin again. I heard that his mother's condition worsened that summer and died after failing to be rescued during a critical illness. Although my father woke up later, he had hurt his head that time. He couldn't speak clearly, and half of his body was inconvenient to move. We sold the big house of the Arthur family, but the money in our hands wasn't even enough to pay off the debts to the suppliers. There was really no other way, so I had to dissolve and close the factory. When we moved, I found that Calvin's things at home had disappeared. When I heard news about him again later, it was already 8 years later. He had become the youngest business elite in our city. Before my father passed away, he saw Calvin's news on TV. He managed to find out his contact information and met with him. My father gestured and said that the thing he was most worried about in his life was me. He begged Calvin to remember the affection of growing up together in those years and take good care of me. Calvin held a cigarette until it burned to the end and then said, "Cecilia, I'll marry her." My father closed his eyes in relief. Calvin took care of all the funeral arrangements. He also paid off all the debts of our family before. Later, we had this marriage in name only. However, just 1 year later, I caught Calvin cheating with that young model. Just because the eyes of that young model were very much like Amanda, who died at the age of 18. Doesn't Calvin know what happened to you guys later? Your father was in the hospital, and the people in the factory were making trouble. You were just an 18-year-old girl. If you didn't sign that letter of understanding, where would you get the money to pay the medical expenses and the workers' wages? I shook my head. He doesn't know. That summer, because he had to accompany his mother for chemotherapy, he was almost soaked in the hospital all day long taking care of her. He didn't know about the accident in our family's factory and my father's hospitalization later. Then why didn't you explain? Chloe looked at me with a look of hating that I couldn't make it. People of your age, don't you know how to talk? Do you all think that the other person can read your mind? Saying nothing and just expecting the other person to understand? I gave a bitter smile. Do you think I didn't explain to him? I did, but he didn't accept my explanation. He said that in that situation, we could completely apply for the company's bankruptcy liquidation. The company's machines, equipment, and the pile of goods in the warehouse could all be used as the company's property to pay off debts. But I just signed that letter of understanding. I was really just eager to get the money. Blame me for being young back then and relying too much on my father. I had never really learned how to manage the company from my father. I really didn't know that there was such a way. I really needed money urgently at that time. If my father hadn't fallen into a coma and been hospitalized at that time, perhaps I wouldn't have taken that step. But it seemed that everything was predestined. Chloe let out a sigh. But anyway, since you're already married, he should be responsible for you and the marriage. You're wrong, little sister. A voice came from the door of the flower shop. Chloe stood up. Sorry, ladies. Our shop is temporarily closed at the moment. If you have flower ordering needs, please call the flower ordering phone number at the door later. I put down my coffee and looked back. 2 people were escorting the smiling Eleanor standing at the door. People have the right to pursue true love at any time in their lives. Miss Cecilia, don't you think so? While speaking, Eleanor walked in and looked around. Not bad. The decoration is quite tasteful, and the flowers are well taken care of too. However, Her attendant wrinkled her nose. Eleanor, if you want flowers, just ask President Calvin to have them airlifted here from Ecuador. Why come to this little unknown flower shop? What good flowers can there be here? Eleanor smiled. You don't understand. Miss Cecilia and Calvin are old acquaintances. I'm here to support Miss Cecilia's business. At this point, someone as sensible as Chloe couldn't fail to understand. Our shop won't do business with this lady. Please leave immediately. Attendant B got unhappy. What's your attitude? Do you know that the properties on this whole street belong to President Calvin? Our Eleanor is the apple of President Calvin's eye. If you offend Eleanor, believe it or not, we'll tell President Calvin and ask him to take back the houses and make you unable to do business anymore. After hearing this, Chloe folded her arms and sneered. If you have the ability, just go ahead and say it. Let's see whether our shop closes first or you get out first. Open your eyes and see clearly. This is Mrs. Calvin's flower shop. How dare you make trouble in front of the rightful owner? Get out of here if you're sensible. For a moment, there was a look of panic on the faces of the two attendants. They nudged Eleanor's arm. Eleanor didn't care at all. Miss Cecilia, actually, I really don't understand. What's the point of a woman staying with a husband who doesn't love her? I sneered, seeing someone who wants something but can't get it no matter how hard they try. Tell me, isn't it interesting? Eleanor quickly splashed the remaining half cup of coffee on the table onto my face. He doesn't love you. Why are you so shameless and still occupying the position of Mrs. Calvin? The coffee splashed onto my hair and clothes, making me look dirty and lampe. I wiped the coffee stains off my face expressionlessly, then raised my leg and kicked Eleanor hard in the stomach. It's not that I want to occupy the position of Mrs. Calvin. It's the man you said doesn't love me who doesn't agree to the divorce. If you can persuade him to change his mind, I'll really thank you. Also, have I been too? How nice to you, dare you come to my place and make a scene? She fell to the ground, knocking over the flower bouquets placed around. Calvin had just walked to the door. Seeing this scene, he pushed the door open and walked in. Eleanor was sitting on the ground, covering her stomach, looking up at him with a aggrieved face and crying. Calvin helped her up and said coldly, "Who did this?" Eleanor's two attendants quickly came up and exaggeratedly told how I had bullied Eleanor. And Eleanor, huddled in Calvin's arms, was crying pitifully. Chloe looked at me worriedly. Actually, I couldn't wait for Calvin to get angry. I had hit his sweetheart. If he got angry and divorced me because of it, I wouldn't lose out no matter how I looked at it. But he didn't. Not to mention getting angry, he didn't even frown. He held Eleanor's shoulders and said gently, "You've always been obedient and sensible. Be good. Didn't you want to buy flowers? I'll buy all the flowers in the shop and give them to you, okay?" Chloe really couldn't hold it in and questioned, "Mr. Calvin, before comforting this lady, shouldn't you first care about your own wife? Can't you see that she was splashed all over with coffee?" Calvin took out a black card from his coat pocket and handed it to Chloe. Mrs. Calvin is used to being proud and never easily lowers her noble head. If she knew how to give in a little, I wouldn't mind supporting her. You. I held back the furious Chloe and reached out to take the card from Calvin. Chloe, go and sort out all the intact flower bouquets in the shop. Mr. Calvin is being so generous in expressing his love, and we can make money. Why not do something that benefits both sides? While swiping the card, I smiled and handed over a pen and paper. Please leave the delivery address and phone number, Mr. Calvin. We will definitely deliver these flowers to you before tonight. Calvin stared at me with his black eyes for a while, and there were emotions brewing in them that I couldn't understand either. No need. You know the home address best, don't you? Tonight, I want to give Eleanor the most romantic evening for just the two of us. I hope Mrs. Calvin is sensible and doesn't come to disturb us. Eleanor's eyes suddenly lit up. Calvin put his arm around her and left the flower shop. Only Chloe and I were left facing the mess in the shop. Suddenly, Chloe started stretching on the spot. Sister Cecilia, you should also warm up and get to work quickly. There are so many flowers in this whole room. We have a tough battle to fight. But with so many flowers, it should cost 4 or 500,000 yuan at least. Did you really swipe so much money from your husband's card? I winked at her. I swiped an extra 100,000 yuan. Don't labor and shipping cost money? Good for you. I laughed heartily. The moment I turned around, tears fell down unexpectedly. I knew that this time, I was really going to say goodbye to Calvin for good. That night, I spent the night in the flower shop. I lay there with my eyes open, watching the sky gradually brighten. From the drawer at the front desk, I took out half a pack of cigarettes left behind by a customer before. I lit one and took a puff. It was choking. But somehow it made me feel more awake. The last time I saw Calvin smoking, I had wanted to try it for a long time. Under what circumstances did he smoke his first cigarette? Was it also like me today, with every puff of smoke accompanied by a sigh? After finishing one cigarette, I got up, changed my clothes, and did my makeup. Then I took a taxi back to the villa. The villa was not lit inside. However, by the sunlight, I could clearly see that the villa was filled with flowers. The curtains in the master bedroom on the second floor were tightly drawn. It seemed that Calvin had indeed had a romantic night. I took out another cigarette and lit it. The choking taste spread in my mouth. Instantly, it brought tears to my eyes. There was a lot of noise and commotion at the entrance of the villa. Several reporters with long and short cameras were desperately trying to push their way in. Calvin's driver was standing in front of the door, shouting sternly that he would call the police if they forced their way in any further. I waited quietly for a few minutes. Finally, I saw a middle-aged couple hurriedly getting out of the car and walking towards here. I threw away the half-smoked cigarette but stepped on it hard to put it out, and walked towards the couple. "Are you Eleanor's parents?" I led Eleanor's parents into the villa. Calvin's driver had a look of guilt and shock on his face. How interesting. The stairs leading to the second floor were also filled with flowers. From a distance, we heard Eleanor's crying. The middle-aged couple's expressions changed. The woman was the first to shout "Eleanor" and rushed over. Then, I heard the sound of slaps and curses. When I walked to the door of the master bedroom, I saw Calvin with scratch marks all over his face, looking disheveled as he was pushed out. He wasn't wearing a shirt, and the ambiguous hickey marks on his neck and chest could be clearly seen. When Calvin saw me, he trembled and tentatively reached out to hold my hand. "Cecilia." I shook his hand off hard. "How dirty." His face instantly turned pale. "Cecilia, I don't know why it turned out like this. I didn't mean to be with her. But I drank too much, and I don't know anything about what happened later." I sneered. "So if you didn't give her the chance to be alone with you, there wouldn't be so many problems." Calvin suddenly got angry. "What about you? You clearly knew that I was with Eleanor in the villa yesterday. Why didn't you come to me? Why didn't you stop it? Do you even consider me your husband at all?" He squeezed my neck hard, forcing me to look up into his eyes. I snorted with laughter. "Husband? Calvin, since the day you cheated on me with Eleanor, you no longer deserve this title." I shook off Calvin's hand and walked straight into the bedroom. The bed was in a mess. On the bedside table were 2 wine glasses and an open box of condoms scattered around. It made me feel sick. Eleanor was naked, only wrapped in a sheet, hiding in her mother's arms, covering her face and crying. However, there was no trace of sadness on her face. I saw that she was wearing a ring on her hand. It was my mother's blue diamond ring that I had put in the safe before. All the blood in my body rushed to my head. Seeing that I was staring straight at her hand, Eleanor looked down at the ring on her finger and then sobbed and said, "Last night, Calvin insisted on putting this ring on my hand. He said it was mine and wouldn't allow me to take it off." I looked back at Calvin, and the anger in my eyes seemed to burn him through. Eleanor continued to show off. "Actually, this diamond isn't that big, and the style is quite old-fashioned." I said I didn't want it, but he still. "Ah." I tightly grasped her wrist, trying to take the ring back. Eleanor's mother pushed me. "Who are you? Let go of my daughter. Why are you acting like a robber and grabbing other people's things as soon as you make a move? Get away. It's mine." I slapped the woman aside and then tried hard to pry open Eleanor's right hand. The ring was a bit tight on her finger. It took me a lot of effort to take the ring off. Eleanor and her mother hugged each other and cried. Eleanor's mother cursed Calvin, who was at the door. "Are you still a man? Your woman is being bullied, and you just stand there and watch. I don't care. You must give our Eleanor an explanation today. Otherwise, we won't let you off." Calvin looked at the woman coldly. "How much money do you want? 1 million? 2 million? Name your price." Eleanor's mother spat. "You think you can get rid of us with just 2 million? I spit on you. You must marry our Eleanor. Our Eleanor has never even been in a relationship before. Do you think you can just sleep with her and then deny it? No way." I put the ring in my pocket, turned around, and looked at Calvin, who had a desperate look on his face at the door and smiled in a good mood. "I'm here today to formally talk to you about divorce. Your situation here seems rather urgent. President Calvin, why don't you sit down and sign the divorce agreement?" Eleanor's parents were no pushovers. They shouted that if Calvin didn't marry Eleanor, they would notify the reporters outside and accuse Calvin of rape. Finally, Calvin signed that divorce agreement. That divorce agreement. Originally I only asked for that blue diamond ring. But Calvin added a clause at the end of the agreement. He divided half of his savings for me. Since he was so generous, wouldn't it be ungrateful of me if I didn't accept it? When he signed the last word, he seemed to have lost all his strength and threw the pen away. I put the agreement in my bag contentedly, stood up, and left. "Cecilia." He called me. "Were Eleanor's parents and the reporters outside brought by you?" I paused for a moment but still didn't turn around. "You're so smart. Since you've already guessed everything, why bother asking me again?" Calvin gave a bitter smile. "To divorce me, you really stopped at nothing. That also depends on whether President Calvin gives me this opportunity." "Cecilia." He called me again, and his voice was a bit shaky. I just want to know, during the 1 year we were married, did you ever love me? I turned around and looked at this man whom I had secretly liked since I was 9 years old. Suddenly, I felt that from the time we met, to our later separation, and then to our marriage and divorce, it seemed that we had never really had a proper conversation.
李戒严认出王诗清是他的救命恩人，也站在他那一边。
That year when I was 17, I gave Calvin a cup of hot chocolate and forced him to drink it in front of me before I let him go. Then, just as he took the first sip, I suddenly confessed my love to him. Calvin, I like you. He choked and coughed repeatedly. I quickly patted him on the back. But he looked at me as if he had seen a ghost. Don't play tricks on me, okay? His face was flushed, but his tone was cold. Cecilia, I'm not a spoiled young master who just reaches out for clothes and opens his mouth for food. I don't have time to play this boring game with you. Whether it was when I was 17 or 27, he never believed that I liked him. Between him and me, it wasn't a matter of who would bow first. His heart was trapped by an invisible glass cover. Trying to break the glass cover, the shards would hurt both of us at the same time. Calvin's eyes turned red. He looked at me, opened his mouth, but didn't say anything. When I walked downstairs and out of the villa, Eleanor's father blocked my way. He looked at me gloomily. Little girl, it's been a long time. 1 month later, Calvin and I got our divorce certificates at the Civil Affairs Bureau. Eleanor came with him. She leaned on Calvin's shoulder and looked at me smugly. Miss Cecilia, Calvin and I have set the wedding for the 6th of next month. If you're free, please come and attend. I'll send you an invitation. She smiled and touched her belly. I'm pregnant. Calvin said that while my belly isn't showing yet, we should hurry up and hold the wedding. Otherwise, it'll be too tiring for me to handle the wedding when my belly gets bigger. Congratulations, I said sincerely. Wish you a harmonious marriage and many children soon. Which hotel is the wedding held at? I'll definitely arrive early. Eleanor was stunned for a moment and then cursed in a low voice, crazy. She turned around and got into the car while Calvin was still standing in front of me, his face as pale as a sheet. Cecilia, don't you care at all that I'm marrying another woman and having a child with her? I remained silent. Suddenly, Calvin raised his voice and the expression on his face was one of bunque and hurt. Why? Why are you always so high and mighty? Clearly, if you had just lowered your tsutai a bit, if you had just told me that you liked me a few more times, I would definitely have believed you. But you were always impatient. When I said I hated you, you really just turned around and walked away. Of course, Eleanor wouldn't really send me an invitation. But I still arrived at the hotel early that day. Watching her holding Calvin's arm and smiling so sweetly, I felt even more delighted in my heart. Laugh. Just keep laughing. Soon you won't be able to laugh anymore. Eleanor was a model and already had a certain level of fame. And she was marrying the youngest business tycoon in the city. This wedding was much grander and more high profile than when Calvin married me last year. 200,000 Aurora roses airlifted from Ecuador decorated the entire wedding venue like a dreamland, for drones were filming this grand wedding from various angles. Calvin had an expressionless face throughout the whole process, as if this grand event had nothing to do with him. And Eleanor was holding the microphone, sweetly sharing with the guests every little detail since she and Calvin got to know each other. Suddenly, her microphone let out a sharp buzzing sound, then a conversation abruptly cut in. Little girl, what's your purpose in painstakingly arranging all this? I don't believe that you really want to help your husband and my daughter Eleanor. The guests in the audience were in an uproar and looked at each other in confusion. What's going on? The person inside said, your husband? Had President Calvin been married before? Some people who knew the situation said, there were rumors in the circle that President Calvin got married last year, but we had never seen his wife show up. We all thought it was a misinformation or that she was confused with today's bride. But now it seems that this bride was the one who broke up President Calvin's marriage. Ah. So she's the mistress? Eleanor's face changed. The conversation continued, I just wanted to divorce Calvin. As for whether I'm helping anyone, I don't care. Mr. Eleanor doesn't need to be so anxious either. Not many people remember the incident where your daughter killed my sister anymore. How dare you bring that up again? Back then, you had already signed the letter of understanding and consent. My daughter was not at fault. If you weren't feeling guilty, why were you in such a hurry to send her abroad back then? It's an undeniable fact that Eleanor hit and killed someone while drunk. Mr. Eleanor was so powerful and wealthy at that time. You pushed me and my father into a desperate situation. I couldn't compete with you. If I didn't sign the letter of understanding, would we still have a way out? I had no choice but to sign it. The hotel manager rushed over and urgently shut down the equipment. But the information that should have been released had already come out. The reporters who came to cover this wedding also quickly pointed their cameras at Eleanor and Calvin. Mrs. Calvin, regarding the case of hitting and killing someone in the revelation just now, do you have anything to add? It was said in there that it was caused by drunk driving. Is that true? Mr. Calvin, did you know in advance about Mrs. Calvin's drunk driving and hitting someone to death? Eleanor nervously grasped Calvin's sleeve beside her. Calvin, help me. But Calvin shook her off. He stared at Eleanor in front of him with bloodshot eyes. Were you the one who killed Amanda back then? Eleanor was scared by his appearance. She cried and shook her head. Amanda? Who's that? I don't know. I only know that I didn't do it on purpose. Those two people suddenly rushed out. They didn't see the car. It has nothing to do with me. The guests below were in an uproar. That's an admission. Driving drunk and hitting someone, what's the difference from intentional homicide? What's even more disgusting is that she threatened the family members. I really don't understand why Mr. Calvin would marry such a woman. It seems that the person she killed was the sister of the previous Mrs. Calvin. Ah? He cheated himself, and the mistress was the culprit who killed his wife's sister? Isn't this bullying people? I stood in a corner of the hotel, watching Calvin shake off Eleanor and stride down the stage, watching Eleanor cry out for him heartbreakingly. Watching the reporters swarming up to take pictures, stepping on her spotless white wedding dress and knocking the 18,000 yuan Duchess bouquet out of her hand, trampling, crushing, and grinding it into a mess of flour mud on the ground. How satisfying. The technology group that I acquired back then was actually Mr. Eleanor's company. Their family's business had been getting worse day by day in recent years, so I took the opportunity to swallow up her father's company whole. Watching them lose everything was also a way to avenge Amanda. However, I didn't expect that when their family fell on hard times, it forced Eleanor, who had been hiding abroad, to come back. What was even more unexpected was that she signed with Calvin's company and caught Calvin's eye. That year, after she hit and killed Amanda, she just peeked out and then drove away in a hurry. Perhaps because of this, Calvin didn't recognize her. But I saw her. Her face and her eyes that were so similar to Amanda's, I had never forgotten them for a single day. Later, when Calvin said that he wanted to have a romantic evening with her in the villa, I knew that the opportunity had come. There's nothing more devastating to a person's mind than falling from heaven to hell in an instant. The mistress of the Calvin group, which was the focus of everyone's attention, turned out to be a murderer. For such scandals and secrets, I didn't need to say anything. Those reporters would naturally dig deeper into it. Soon, all of Eleanor's modeling jobs were urgently suspended. There was an official notice that such artists with bad records must be completely banned. The pressure of public opinion brought the case from that year back to the surface again. Drunk driving, hit and run, bribing to smooth things over, each of these was enough to send her to prison for several years. When the rainy season came, I started having a low fever continuously. I couldn't ask for leave at the company, so I, like a poor little cabbage, could only endure until the weekend to see a doctor. Chloe helped me put my luggage in the taxi and then gave me a hug. Sister Cecilia, have a safe trip. Call me when you arrive. I nodded. There was nothing left in this city that I cared about or was reluctant to leave. I booked a plane ticket to Kunming, Yunnan. I heard that there are flowers surrounding the place all year round. I contracted a flower field there. From now on I'll just plant flowers, drink tea, and live my own carefree life. When the plane rushed into the clouds, my heart suddenly beat a few times faster. I felt a bit uncomfortable. The flight attendant considerately brought me a cup of hot water. Miss, take a nap first. There's still a little over an hour before we land. I nodded. Outside the plane, the brilliant sunlight pierced through the clouds. I wrapped the blanket tightly around me and fell into a deep sleep. Extra chapter. Calvin. After Eleanor's affairs were exposed by the media, her parents came to his home every day, crying and making a fuss. He coldly responded to them that he couldn't do anything and couldn't help Eleanor. What a joke. At this time, not stepping on her was already being merciful to her. He never expected that she would be the murderer who killed Amanda back then. There was chaos at home, and there were reporters staking out at the company. He was extremely annoyed. He drove out and aimlessly drove through the city. Before he knew it, he had driven to the door of Cecilia's flower shop. It was almost empty inside. He felt a chill in his heart and quickly got out of the car and pushed the door open. A girl was packing up the last few things. Hearing the sound, she turned around. When she saw him, the expression on her face froze. He remembered her. She was the little girl who helped in Cecilia's shop. But Cecilia was nowhere to be seen. Suddenly, he had a bad premonition. Where is she? Where's Cecilia? The girl didn't want to say much at first but couldn't resist his repeated pleas and finally said, Sister Cecilia just left. She has a plane ticket today and is flying to Kunming. She probably won't come back in the future. She said that there's no one and nothing in the city that she cares about or is reluctant to leave anymore. A sharp pain hit his heart. He stumbled out of the door, got into the car immediately, started it, and rushed towards the airport at full speed. There was only one thought in his mind. Keep her, keep her. Even if she slapped him a few times, even if he had to kneel down and beg her, it would be okay. As long as she was willing to stay by his side. He wouldn't be so stubborn anymore. He wanted to tell her that, in fact, when they were young, she had repeatedly appeared in his dreams. It's just that at that time, he was too self-abased. Just as Cecilia said, he had nothing, and even his living expenses depended on her father's support. How could a person like himself be liked by this flamboyant and dazzling girl? However, she came to tease him again and again. He almost believed that she really liked him, but that day, he heard her true feelings in the coffee shop. She said that he was just fostered in their family. The hope in his heart was extinguished once again. Later, because of the letter of understanding and consent that Cecilia signed, they completely broke up. He hated Cecilia, hated why she could forgive the murderer who killed Amanda for the sake of money. He also hated himself, hated why he had nothing and didn't even have the means to ask her not to sign it. Later, it took him 8 years to finally become wealthy. Cecilia's family had nothing left and lost the prosperity of those days. For the sake of Cecilia's father's dying request and also for his own selfish reasons, he married Cecilia. She no longer had the arrogance of those days, nor the liveliness. Later, he saw Eleanor in the company. For a moment, he was in a daze. Those beautiful and lively facial features, especially the vivid eyes, were so much like Cecilia when they were young. It's just that she was much shyer and gentler than Cecilia. When she lowered her eyes and called him President Calvin, his heart skipped a beat. He doted on Eleanor, enjoying her submissiveness while trying to find Cecilia's shadow in her. He just didn't expect that this seemingly gentle and harmless little rabbit would set him up. He thought, when Cecilia recognized that Eleanor was the one who killed Amanda back then, why didn't she tell him? He would definitely have stood by her side. But she didn't tell him. She didn't believe him. She would rather use him as bait and set up a trap to expose Eleanor. It was his fault. Was it that difficult to open up his heart to the person he liked? Why did he waste so much time testing and provoking Cecilia's feelings? Couldn't he just bravely say first that he loved her? It didn't matter. It didn't matter. He told himself that it wasn't too late yet. Calvin stepped on the gas and rushed towards the airport. The car drove onto the Pingjiang Bridge. Calvin kept changing lanes and overtaking. He thought in his mind, faster, faster. He didn't notice at all that he had already driven into the opposite lane. He looked down at the time. There was no time left. Suddenly, he heard the urgent sound of horns. He looked up in panic and saw a truck speeding towards him in the opposite lane. His face changed drastically, and he had to turn the steering wheel sharply, trying to avoid the oncoming vehicle. The car instantly lost its balance. It crashed through the railing beside it. Calvin only felt the feeling of weightlessness hitting him. His mind went blank. A dozen seconds later, he and the car plunged into the turbulent Pingjiang River. The moment the river water flooded over his head, he seemed to hear the roar of the plane. Was it still too late? Tears flowed out of his eyes and mixed with the river water. It said that before a person dies, they will see the person they want to see the most. Calvin closed his eyes. But Cecilia, why didn't you come? The end.